And it's 16 minutes after the hour. For the first time since 1979, they marched yesterday. It was called the National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights, a rally for equal treatment and a demand for government help in fighting AIDS. Yesterday was also a time for mourning, a sunrise ceremony to unfurl an enormous quilt with the name of someone who died of AIDS on each panel. The panels, months in the making, and Hattie Kaufman followed the project to Washington from its beginnings across the continent.
Shoppers in San Francisco found something different caught their eye in the window of Neiman Marcus department store. It was not the latest fashion, but names of the latest victims of AIDS. Names stitched in fabric, displayed openly. The windows, which were supposed to hold merchandise, held instead a memorial.
We felt this was something that we had these big windows, we could give this exposure. It was just a natural. It just seemed so obvious once the idea struck us that we should do it. Some of them are obviously made by people who are almost professional sewers. Others are very, very hand-done and almost amateurish. But what comes through is they're all done with such love.
The name panels may be sewn for loved ones or perhaps for strangers. This woman never knew the 2-year-old baby Jessica, who died of AIDS after a blood transfusion. But the woman thought the child should be remembered. Others stitch in memory of those they knew well. It was a year ago Good Morning America visited Andrew Finocchio. 2 months later, he passed away. Ron Cordova cared for Finocchio through his illness and created this panel in his honor.
It was like a release of a lot of anger, a lot of sadness, a celebration of his life. I took care of him for like 12 months before he died. And actually the panel is like a painting that he did. It really explained a lot about him, about where he was at, because he was like this loving person, but then there was this like deep sadness and helplessness over this disease that he a lot of times pretended not to have. But he kept on living, that's the thing. That's like what I learned so much. You take care of somebody like this for a long time and you learn.
Hoping to share what they've learned, thousands have gathered here on the Capitol Mall in Washington, D.C. They're laying out the name panels, now sewn together to form a patchwork quilt in memory of the victims of the disease.
This is a way of saying thanks, I suppose.
Rob Hale, Stephen Richter.
At daybreak, the names were read.
Roger Reinhold, Jose Salz.
A name for each panel, a name for each person remembered.
My son's panel is here, and I am here in his memory, and also to fight for the rights of all the other patients right now.
I'm sick of seeing my friends die. It's a ridiculous idea that we can't get any federal money or any more federal money.
On our workshop in San Francisco and here again today, there's so much pain and so much sorrow. And we're getting through it, and we're loving each other, and we're laughing, and we're continuing on with our lives.
And joining us now from Washington are Pat Norman, one of the national co-chairs of yesterday's march, and Congressman Gary Studs, one of just 2 openly gay members of the House, and one of those who was at the front of the marchers yesterday. Good morning to the 2 of you. Pat, the first march since 1979, why now? What specifically is the gay movement after?
Well, we have to have our rights. The AIDS epidemic happened and left us because people discriminated against people who are believed to be just about the lowest in this country. If it had been other people, we would never have had to deal with this kind of problem. Now, with the Hardwick decision as well, taking away our privacy, we decided this is the time to act.
Congressman Studs, AIDS overlays all of this, in effect, and while it draws sympathy, doesn't it make getting equal rights politically all the tougher for the gay movement?
I don't think so. I don't think we really know the answer to that question yet. I think if there's a message that comes through all of the components of this weekend, the most moving of which certainly you just showed in that last segment, it is that members of Congress to whom this appeal was addressed, as well as the President, who, stereotypes notwithstanding, are for the most part very decent men and women who know what is right and want to do the right thing, but sometimes have the trouble finding the courage to do what they darn well know is right, that it's okay in a conventional political sense at this point to do what's right. There was an enormous cross-section of America out there yesterday, I think reflecting the real decency and common sense of the people of this country, saying, Mr. President, members of the Congress, have the courage of your own convictions, do what you darn well know is right, get out there, do adequate funding, provide us some leadership, assume the best in us, assume our capacity to respond with compassion and with love. Don't pander to what you fear is the worst in us, which is our fear and ignorance and prejudice, which is also in all of us. I think people are just demanding that we have some semblance of leadership in this country at a time of crisis.
Well, I know, for instance, one of the goals of the movement has been to expand the 1964 Civil Rights Act to prevent discrimination based on sexual preference. Is there any real reasonable opportunity of that happening in this Congress?
I don't anticipate in all candor that happening in this Congress, but I must say that it's, if one thinks about it, it's really remarkable that in 1987 in the United States, one is still debating whether or not fundamental civil rights ought to be extended to all American citizens. In an awful lot of senses, one would like to think that debate was well behind us. It is not. We don't have an equal rights amendment to guarantee fundamental civil liberties to 51% of our population in terms of women at this point. The approximately 10% who are gay and lesbian are coming along in their own historical time, but it is more than a shame at this point. It is a tragedy of the most extraordinary proportions that it's taken as long as it has.
Pat Norman, is the problem legislative or is it attitudinal? Is there still an attitudinal hurdle that is huge, that has to be overcome in most people's minds?
Yes, it certainly is, and that's one of the other reasons that we've marched here specifically. We believe that by reaching out to the rest of the nation and showing who we are, really, which is basically your children, your mothers and fathers, cousins and sisters and brothers, that all of us will begin to know each other better and change the kinds of myths that people have conjured up in their minds.
Pat Norman, Congressman Studs, thanks both for being with us this morning.